Welcome to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, the show where brilliant professionals share how to sharpen the universal skills required to flourish at work. Enjoy more career fun, wins, meaning, and money with your host, Pete Makaitis.
Hello and welcome to episode 900, Big 900 with Charles Conn. Charles has had an extremely impressive career. He knows a boatload about problem solving and thriving in uncertain times, and he shares some power tools that can aid you in many, many circumstances in which you are trying to figure out what the heck is going on, finding the right answer, communicating it well such that folks respond, and great things can happen. So you'll learn 1, how talented people unknowingly self-sabotage. 2, the simple question that leads to clever breakthroughs. And 3, how to communicate your ideas so people actually care. So if you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've referenced here, please drop on by awesomeatyourjob.com/EP900. Now here's a little bit about Charles. Charles Conn is an investor, environmentalist, and entrepreneur. He's co-founder of Monograph, a venture firm, and was previously CEO of the Rhodes Trust in Oxford. He's board chair of Patagonia and sits on the Nature Conservancy European Council. He was founding CEO of Ticketmaster-Citysearch and was a partner at McKinsey Company. He's a graduate of Harvard, Oxford, and Boston universities, and he's the co-author with Robert McLean of Bulletproof Problem Solving, The One Skill That Changes Everything, a bestseller now in 6 languages, and The Imperfectionists, Strategic Mindsets for Uncertain Times. Big thanks to Charles for sharing his wisdom with us, and big thanks to our sponsors. Check them out. One sponsor to check out is Storyworth. Whenever I'm thinking about meaningful Father's Day gifts, Storyworth leaps to mind. Storyworth helps you preserve precious memories and stories from your father for years to come. Each week, Storyworth emails your loved ones a thought-provoking question that you get to help pick, such as, what's the bravest thing you've ever done? I personally love the prompt so much that I have refreshed Storyworth's questions page many times looking for more. Storyworth makes the writing process super quick and easy. All your loved one needs to do is respond to that email with a story, and then you get a quick copy of that. And after a year of this fun, Storyworth compiles your loved one's stories and photos into a beautiful keepsake hardcover book that you'll be able to share and revisit for generations to come. Families love Storyworth so much, they've got 25,000 5-star reviews on Trustpilot and have millions of stories preserved. So give all the fathers in your life a unique, heartfelt gift they'll all cherish for years. Storyworth. Right now, you can save $10 on your first purchase when you go to storyworth.com/awesome. That's storyworth.com/awesome to save $10 on your first purchase. One sponsor to check out is Harvard Business Review. This brilliant magazine, published at hbr.org, is the leading destination for smart management thinking. Fun fact, HBR has been mentioned in 108 episodes of the show. That's because HBR has great stuff that comes up often. They've got explainer videos, podcasts, real-world case studies, and much more. I think of HBR each night that I put on my special orange glasses. Their article, Will Blue Light Glasses Improve Your Sleep?, revealed that those who wore them reported better sleep and a 7% improvement in work performance as compared to those who wore the sham glasses. So I cite HBR anytime anyone tells me that I look silly wearing them. Now, much of HBR's content is available for free when you sign up at their site. Subscriptions that get you unlimited content cost $10 a month. If you visit hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME, you can save 10% off of that subscription. Again, to save 10% off of your HBR subscription, go to www.hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME. And big thanks to our sponsor, Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing for your future. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to invest with Acorns. In fact, you can get started with just your spare change. Acorns recommends an expert-built portfolio that fits you and your money goals, then automatically invests your money for you. NerdWallet.com, whom I love on these sorts of matters, gives Acorns a whopping 4.7 stars and says, quote, if you want to make the most of your spare change, there's no better place to do that than Acorns. Head to acorns.com/awesome or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. And we got a legal disclaimer here. It may not be representative of all clients. Tier 1 compensation provided. Compensation provides an incentive to positively promote Acorns. View important disclosures at acorns.com/awesome. Investing involves risk, including the loss of principal. Please consider your objectives, risk tolerance, and Acorns' fees before investing. Acorns Advisors LLC, Acorns, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. Brokerage services are provided to clients of Acorns by Acorns Securities LLC, member at FINRA/SIPC. For more information, visit acorns.com. Now, here's Charles. Charles, welcome to How to Be Awesome at Your Job.
It's great to be here, Pete. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited to dig into your wisdom in the book. There are Imperfectionists, Strategic Mindsets for Uncertain Times. and general problem-solving wisdom you have to share with us. But first, I'm curious. So you're the board chair of Patagonia. I'm imagining that you're an outdoorsy person then. Is this fair to say?
Yeah, my big passion is to spend time outside.
Are there any particularly memorable tales of outdoor adventures that leap to mind?
Yeah, I have explored on several occasions, the very upper reaches of the Skeena River in British Columbia, which runs almost the entire length of the province and goes from these incredibly beautiful mountains all the way down to the sea. And that one's deep in my heart.
That's beautiful. And have you ever had any close encounters with death in your adventures?
Yes, on several occasions, once involving a landslide, also in northern Canada, this time on a lake called Mistassini in northern Quebec, and a couple times in boats.
Hot dog. And what does that do for you? Like internally, like how you view the world and your priorities?
That's a good question. I think it sharpens you up on what's important, makes you focus on not all the little things that are the day-to-day, but on the bigger things that actually matter.
Well, I think we're talking about something that matters a whole heck of a lot in terms of strategic mindsets, problem solving. Could you kick us off by sharing a particularly surprising or counterintuitive discovery you've made about mindsets and problem solving and such while putting together the Imperfectionists?
I think perhaps the one that's hardest for people to get their own heads around is to be comfortable with the idea of collective intelligence or outsourcing wisdom, whether that's outsourcing it to ancient wisdom or outsourcing it to artificial intelligence swarms. It's very hard for people to think that they don't have everything inside themselves. But of course we don't, and we can't.
Well, now, what I find counterintuitive is that people find that counterintuitive. That's so meta. I was like, maybe I'm humble or just a dummy. But I'm thinking, of course, I don't have the answers. And in a way, that's kind of a relief. I'm not on the hook, on the spot, expected to. Can you dig into this mindset a little bit?
Yeah, and I think it's what happens in big organizations, and you've worked for fancy consulting organizations. People over time sort of overcome that natural humility that you just described and begin to think that their organizations can do remarkable things. And it's that idea that you remember Enron, they thought they were the smartest guys in the room. And that kind of idea, like the arrogance of thinking we're the smartest guys in the room, and therefore all of the pieces of the solutions to the problems that we're trying to solve can be found here, is a fundamental delusion that especially talented people tell themselves.
Okay. Well, good to know that is widespread. And I guess that kind of hits me interestingly because I'm thinking about, boy, there was a quote, I've got to get this guy on the show. I think he was in the Bush cabinet. He said, "Some people are more certain of everything than I am of anything." And I thought that is exactly how I feel all the time, because people will say things with such definitive language and tone of voice and use the word obviously. I was like, oh, it's obvious. And it's like, I don't know. I'm not so sure that that's the case. And occasionally they're just dead wrong. And so I've sort of had to, in my mind, mentally attach a disclaimer to like all things being shared in general casual conversation.
And don't you find as we get older, that instinct to humility should get stronger, and often it doesn't?
Well, I think so.
And that's what makes someone boring, right? That they're confident that they know everything that there is to know, and they're not open to new mindsets, new ways of seeing things, new lenses.
Certainly. Well, and I think about just how many times I've been dead wrong about things. So it's like, I have evidence to suggest that it's quite probable that I may be mistaken about something, especially with my first impressions pre-research.
When we're young, we often have that kind of confidence, never in doubt, occasionally correct. Hopefully the world gives us the evidence that you just described. Usually it does.
All right. Okay, so there's something surprising that popped up. Could you maybe zoom out and hear the big picture or the thesis behind the book, The Imperfectionists, Strategic Mindsets for Uncertain Times?
Yeah, so here's 30,000 feet on it. I mean, there's always this sense that the world's getting faster and faster. And now it really is. I mean, there's objective evidence with the amount of new data that's being produced every day, the impact of artificial intelligence, computational biology, robotics. It's a blur. And no young people today can look at their parents' or their grandparents' careers and think, I will have something like that. This idea that you could gather a body of knowledge in high school and university and then put that into work over 40 years, if it ever really did hold, certainly doesn't hold now. And that creates a feeling of anxiety and anomie. And you see this a lot in young people. There's an epidemic of anxiety and also depression because of that sense that we are unmoored. And my sense is that instead of looking for perfection so that we know all of the moving parts and we can confidently solve the problems in our lives, that we should actually let go of that idea. And we should lean into the risk and uncertainty that the world is delivering up to us by using some mindsets that actually tame that or make sense of it for us. So that's the 30,000 feet about what the book's about.
Okay, well, there's so much great stuff to dig into here. So let's hear about the anxiety and depression coming from a sense of being unmoored. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think the way we're all taught to think about our lives and companies are taught to think about strategy is to think that there's a structure out there that you can understand. Markets have structures, lives have structures, and that there are agents that operate within this structure. And if you do some thinking about what their incentives are, you can actually deduce what the right strategy for you is, right? That's a very standard model of strategy, sometimes called structure conduct. And I think the world that we operate in now, that structure is changing so quickly that understanding the rules or dynamics of how agents will behave in those fluid structures has diminished or gone out the window. And that leaves many people who are looking for structure, conduct, rules, feeling anomie. And in the businesses that we all operate in today, compared to the past, you don't even know who the disruptive entrant is going to be to your nonprofit or to your business. It may be one of these super competitors like an Apple or an Amazon who you don't even think of as operating in your sphere. And I think that creates a kind of a feeling of uncertainty in a world that's changing quickly that makes many people freeze, paralyze, or makes other people leap before they look, both of which are pathological responses to uncertainty.
Okay, and just a definition check for anomie. What does this word mean?
So anomie is this sister to entropy, the idea that we're lost in a world where there's no meaning and no touch points or milestones.
And so I can see how depression or anxiety might be in the sense of, this is solvable, but I just can't, so I guess I'm no good. It was one direction versus anxiety, like, there's nothing to hold on to.
I don't know what to do.
And it's freaky. Okay.
Exactly.
And so then you say if we let go of this notion and that there are structures, this is solvable, et cetera, that we can feel liberated from that.
That's right. And I think it doesn't mean we just sort of lean into anomie. It means we actually have some tools that are well within our capabilities to make sense of this faster moving world. The fact that we don't have simple structure and conduct doesn't mean there isn't structure and content. We can actually learn the game that's being played. It's just the rules are changing and it's unfolding quickly. So we need an orientation toward uncertainty and change, which helps us gather information to make good decisions and to be successful, even when things are changing quickly.
Okay. Well, so this sounds super beneficial. We can let go of some of that anxiety and depression. And what are some of the other benefits associated with mastering these skills and mindsets?
Yeah, well, so I think you said mastery, and I think a feeling of mastery, even in a world when things are changing, a quiet confidence that even when things are changing, you can actually chart a course that makes sense. Not a course without mistakes, because mistakes and learning from mistakes are a critical part of this framework for getting comfortable operating in this world of change. Okay.
And could you share a cool, maybe case study of someone who felt some of these challenges and adopted some new approaches and saw cool results?
So I think the very most important mindset will sound incredibly obvious, but I think it's actually really profound, which is curiosity. Humans are pattern recognizers when we're young. We look for patterns that help us make sense of the world. And then as we get older, we become pattern imposers so that we can make sense of confusing things. The problem with pattern imposition is we often get it wrong, right? This is what Daniel Kahneman wrote about when he wrote about all the cognitive errors that humans do in thinking fast and thinking slow. If we can stay curious, even as we get older, we can actually be open to learning in this world that's going faster and faster. Now, I'll give you two little case studies. One is Nespresso. So everybody knows what Nespresso is. It was created by Nestle, which is one of the world's biggest food companies and biggest producers of coffee. Nestle had a young engineer. His name was Eric Fev, and he happened to be with his wife visiting Rome. And he was standing there thinking he wanted a coffee, and he noticed that there were a whole bunch of coffee shops in Rome, and only one of them had a queue out the door. And instead of thinking, well, I don't want to stand in that queue, I'm going to go to this one, he said, I wonder what's going on here. Why are people queuing outside the door? And the name of the coffee shop was St. Eustachio's. So he waited in the queue and he went inside, and there was this old barista in there called Eugenio. And he thought the machine was broken. So he was pumping the espresso machine and putting extra bars of pressure into everybody's coffee. And the result was this incredible thick crema on the top of everybody's coffee. And that's why people were waiting. And Fev's curiosity didn't stop there. He obviously enjoyed the coffee. But he went away and he thought, I wonder how we can make that, give people that experience, that actual experience of being in a Roman coffee shop in their home. And he tinkered and experimented. He was actually a rocket scientist, and he figured out how to create pressure via the machine, what we now think of as an espresso machine and an espresso capsule, so that you can produce that wonderful thick crema in your coffee at home. Took 8 years to do it. Nestle gave him the time and the space to do it. And he created a business that does about $10 billion a year in revenue, all from curiosity.
Absolutely. And I think that line, that really is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to curiosity. It's like, are you impatient, in a rush, need to do what's latest and loudest and now?
Right.
Or are you like, what's that about? It's going to take more time and maybe be kind of annoying, but let's go with it and see what happens here.
Right. And in this world, this feeling of anxiety that we've got to just sort of keep our nose at the coalface, we often let those experiences pass by. And those are the experiences that give us insights that actually give us that feeling of mastery and confidence when things are changing quickly.
Okay. And so then when it comes to the mindset of curiosity, what do we do with that sort of actionably? Hey, just be more curious.
Well, yeah. And so that doesn't sound right. But the truth is we can put it into practice by stopping to notice. And that thing is, kids, we always ask the question, why? In fact, there's all this research. Kids ask something like 100 questions an hour. It's incredible. And what they're doing is trying to find patterns that make sense, right? And when they eventually learn how to tie a shoelace with a double bow, that problem's solved, and they become a pattern imposer after that. This is how we tie a shoe. They don't experiment with how to tie their shoe. How can you leave open that childlike way of asking why? Eric Fev stood there on the cobblestones of Rome and asked, why? And I do think curiosity can be as encouraging, or spurring curiosity can start with putting questions when we see phenomenon that we don't immediately impose a pattern on.
And so just ask why about anything and everything that pops on up.
Everything, especially stuff that's anomalous, right? So we tend to look at things that are anomalous and we put them into the bucket of not an important data point because it doesn't confirm something that we wanted to confirm or that's natural to confirm. Or we bucket it very quickly into, I guess they're short a barista there. And that's why there's a queue. We use the wrong, and you said it, we're impatient creatures.
And so once we ask why, I guess then the next step is to try to see what's going on.
Another great case study, which I wouldn't go into in detail, is how instant photography was invented. Edwin Land was, now a famous chemist, was walking around Santa Fe, New Mexico with his daughter, and he was taking pictures with his conventional film camera. And his little daughter, Jennifer, pulled on his sleeve and said, "Let me see the picture, Daddy." He knelt down and he said, "Oh, well, that doesn't work because, we're exposing a film emulsion to light, and then we send that to the drugstore." And he stopped himself and he realized, no, why can't we see the picture? And it was his curiosity, instead of just brushing his daughter off, that led him to spend the rest of the day walking around Santa Fe thinking, I wonder if I could make the pictures appear instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And he was working with a patent attorney that night. that very night to develop what we think of as the Polaroid Instamatic camera.
That's cool. Okay, so we got curiosity. What's next?
The next one I think is really important, and it's kind of a sister idea, is one we call occurrent behavior. Occurrent behavior means what actually happens in the world as opposed to what you wish would happen or think will happen. And for us, it means an experimentalist approach. And you can see why that's a cousin to curiosity. It means instead of accepting existing data sets, you actually create your own data. When you were a Bain consultant and I was a BCG consultant, one of the first things that they tell you when you started a new piece of work or study or a case, they're called different things, different places, is you'd look out for the existing data sets that you could purchase or rent so that you could begin to immediately draw insights. But everybody has access to those purchasable data sets. And they don't represent whatever current reality is because they were collected before. And an experimentalist or a current behavior mindset says, I wonder if we can test or taste the market ourselves. And you can do this in any part of your life rather than accepting what exists to see if you can generate your own perspective. So a current behavior is trying it. And I think we think of that a lot when we think about internet companies. So in internet companies, we think, oh, you can just try interface B or interface A, and you can see which one generates more traffic or more revenue. But you can do this kind of thinking in any business. One of my favorite crazy examples is SpaceX. Whether you're a fan of Elon Musk or not, what he's done in only 15 or 20 years with SpaceX is incredible. You had NASA for 60 years sending parcels into space, including people. And during that entire time, they didn't drive down the cost curve in a period of only 15 years because he was willing to relentlessly experiment, going from sending 3 or 4 missions into space a year, is what NASA was doing, to sending 15 or 20 missions into space a year, which is what SpaceX has been doing. And each time trying something new, including using technologies from the automotive industry, like heat shielding, using innovations like using a basket or a net to catch the nose cone, which is an expensive part that you might otherwise lose. They've been able to drive down the cost curve by about 95%. So cutting the cost of sending a kilogram into space from 50,000 to just over 2,000. It's remarkable. And it shows that even in the ultimate of heavy industries, experimentation can lead remarkable results.
That's good. That's good. And when you say experimentation, I'm thinking SpaceX, they've had a number of things explode. And I guess that's part of it.
Right. So, and I think this is part of imperfection. Now, obviously, unplanned disassembly, which I think was the term that they used in a $100 million mission, is an extreme example of what sometimes comes at a cost. Experiments come at a cost. But there were 20 different things, according to the commentary by SpaceX at the time, that they were trying to experiment with in that launch and that they learned from and that they'll improve from, right? In any of human enterprise, with relative low cost, in this case, it was relatively high cost, we can generate new data that gives us a better sense for how the world's actually unfolding.
Well, this is sparking some cool connections. We had Sunil Gupta on the show talking about being backable. And he said one thing that makes you phenomenally persuasive is you have an earned secret. It's like you know something that other folks don't know. And one of the best ways to do that is just do those experiments. And then this sort of speaks to fundamental problem-solving process, whether we're in uncertain times or not so uncertain environments. Just that hypothesis-driven thinking approach that we're into in consulting is so huge. It's like, what must be true for this to be a good move or work out? And then how do we test that? And so just for funsies, could you share with us a couple really cool examples of means of experimenting and testing that are accessible to the typical professional in the midst of problems they'd bump into?
Yeah, so one that it's an old story from some friends of mine in McKinsey, which is another firm that I worked at, who were trying to solve a really difficult problem when they were working with the Federal Reserve, which is, how do you count money, right? And this is in the days before counting machines. So in the late 70s, they were actually counting money by hand. And they would double and triple count the big bundles of $100 bills and $20 bills, if you can believe it. And they thought that was a far more accurate approach than any other approach. And one of these clever consultants said, seems like a slow and error-prone approach because they would often do tests and find that the counts were off. Why don't we weigh the money? It was just a crazy idea, but with a very accurate scale and money at a particular humidity, so specific gravity, weighing is much more accurate than counting. And they were able to demonstrate that. I think that's just one of those really cool little examples, which is exploring your curiosity by doing a mini experiment, in this case, weighing the money, led to kind of a breakthrough in how the Federal Reserve thought about counting money. Later on, that was bypassed by great counting machines. But I just think that's one of those that's what a beautiful example.
It's fun, and it reminds me of my favorite TV show ever, Breaking Bad, in which they also have to weigh the money, the stacks of it in the storage facility.
Oh, dear.
That is a good one. Well, I'd also loved your take on experiments about where we have to predict the future. And so, for example, one of my favorite encounters of one of my failures in using good hypothesis-driven thinking was I was exploring making an investment in, this is back in the day, in a magazine that went to producers of TV and radio shows because I wanted to, sell a book and associated speaking services. But the price tag for that ad was sort of substantial for me at the time. And I was like, oh, is this going to work out? I mean, at the end of the day, am I going to recoup more money than I invest in this thing? And that's all based on the responsiveness, both of the producers and of the end consumers or listening or watching. I was like, how can I even know? And so I went in the wrong direction as a consultant. I was like, well, let's just assume this and this and this and this and this and make it a spreadsheet. I'm just making up numbers. And I was like, well, those numbers seem reasonable. Let's go for it. And it was a total bust. Very much regret that investment. And then months later, I got a phone call from someone. Said, hey, Pete, noticed your ad in this publication. Can you tell me how'd that work out for you? I was like, oh, not well. But what I should have done is what you're doing. It's like I had a whole content info of all these people who bought the ad, and I could have just give them a ring and say, hey, how'd this work out for you? And then I would have known and saved some money.
Yeah, and that's one of those great problem-solving techniques, which is called Occam's razor, which, is a 15th century idea, which is the best solution to the problem is usually one that requires the least assumptions. And you could have started with that approach, which was
Absolutely.
The simplest one right in front of our nose. And we often, especially clever people, and I think that's what's amazing here, is that these techniques are not to help ordinary people behave like clever people. These are techniques that help clever people even more because we're the worst pattern imposers, the people who are very confident about their abilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Occam's razor, this book, I think it was called Obvious Atoms. It was just like, the idea was, hey, just do the obvious thing in business and it will take you really far, which in some ways is what I like is best about AI is that, and there was a Wall Street Journal article about AI coming up with creative business ideas more so than Penn MBAs. I'm a little skeptical, but I mean, either way, I've heard elsewhere it said that AI tends to give you the most obvious answer because it's like picking the words that are next to other words around this thing and large language models. But that in and of itself is super helpful. It's like, oh yeah, let's do that obvious thing. That's pretty handy. Let's go ahead and do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And basic large language models that are trained on the internet, which is, the junkyard of HTML that is the internet, are likely to give pretty obvious and not creative solutions. I do think AI trained on better databases, and particularly the kind of underlying databases, can actually generate surprising and sometimes creative outcomes because it isn't looking to impose a particular pattern. It isn't working with a set of assumptions the way you and I often do.
All right. Okay, Charles, well, we talked about curiosity, occurrent behavior, experiments. Is there another key mindset or piece we should dig into?
So the other mindset that we think is really powerful, we call dragonfly eye. And the analogy of the dragonfly eye is because they have these incredible compound eyes that have all these different lenses, more than 30,000 lenses, and a couple of different types of receptors that allow them to see almost 360 and also allow them to see spectra of light that no human can see. We don't really know how that insect experiences the world, but we like this idea when you're problem solving of making sure to test different perspectives than your own. And sometimes people call that perspective taking, so maybe that would be a simpler way of putting it. When you're solving a problem, remember to step out of your shoes because your shoes are the shoes of the organization that you're working in and your particular set of beliefs about how your organization competes in the world. So what we'd encourage people to do is see the problem through the eyes of others. So that might be your suppliers, it might be your employees, it might be from one of your existing competitors, or it might be a perspective like an incipient or potential competitor. And we think that's a particularly useful lens. So trying your problem on through the perspective of others, which is a relatively straightforward thing to do, you can workshop this, gives you insights that other people just don't have. And I'll give you an example. It's one that I love and done by a friend of mine, is Invisalign. So you're familiar with Invisalign, which are these clear braces that have just taken the orthodontic world by storm over the last 20 years or so. Were those invented by an orthodontist?
I'm guessing not, but I don't actually know. Lay it on us, Charles.
You got it, right? So why not? I mean, there have been various forms of braces around since actually the time of the pharaohs, but the kind of metal tracks that we have today have been around for something like 70 or 80 years. Why is it that orthodontists who get paid so much money to put those tracks on didn't think of these clear, progressive teeth corrections that Invisalign thought of? It was thought up by two students at Stanford Business School. One of them was a kid who didn't have the money to get braces until he was in his mid-20s, actually at business school. He was noticing how awkward it felt to have braces as a mid-20s person. He also noticed that when he got his braces off, that if he forgot to put his retainer in for a couple of days, when he put it in, it hurt. And then it stopped hurting. And what he noticed, therefore, was that his retainers were also moving his teeth. And he and his colleague, who's called Kelsey Worth, thought, I wonder if you could do 3D printing using a hard, clear plastic like this retainer that would move people's teeth just like the ugly braces do. They were taking the perspective of a braces patient or braces user, not the perspective of an orthodontist who was just looking for the technical teeth correction. With a different lens, they ended up creating a business. It was very difficult to do because no one wanted to support them in dentistry. But eventually they got a school of dentistry to help them do the engineering. They got some engineers at Stanford to help them do the 3D printing. And they created a business that's worth $20 billion in market capitalization today and has totally democratized orthodontia. It used to just be a small group of people who made that money. Now any dentist can fit it. So I think it's an incredible insight. It came from seeing things through different perspective that other people didn't think. And it's one of the most powerful ways that you can improve your own life, which is to stop and see things through a different perspective.
So I get with the Invisalign story that it was an atypical perspective that we wouldn't expect it to come from. And so in practice, if we're trying to take others' perspectives, how do you recommend we do it? We just ask, hey, any ideas for how to correct teeth, or what's the process?
Yeah, I think, for me, I love workshops, and maybe you do too. I love getting people in a room. One of the most powerful things you can ever do is get your customers in a room. Never understand why people don't do that. And whether you work in a nonprofit or a for-profit organization, you can bring the people into the room who you're trying to provide services to and ask them, how do you see my product? And listen to what they're saying. Now, sometimes that doesn't work when the product's super breakthrough. In this case, they wouldn't have told you that they wanted Invisalign, but what they would have told you is how awkward they felt getting braces, how painful it was getting braces, how they couldn't wait to get their braces off, right? So imagine the original Sony Walkman. A focus group wouldn't have created the Sony Walkman. They didn't have it in their minds to do so. But asking people how they wanted to consume their music, which was increasingly mobile, actually could have created the Sony Walkman. I think that's the kind of insight that comes from stepping outside your own pattern imposition framework and thinking about whatever the problem is from the eyes of others.
I think that's well said there. And what is what's that Henry Ford quote? If we asked the customers what they wanted, they'd say they wanted faster carriages or something like that. And so some would say, oh, well, customers don't know. We have to figure it out for them. But I think that what you're saying is like within that is like, well, you're getting at something. If the customers say that, then, well, that can spark some things to go forward and innovate.
Customers know their pain points and customers know their druthers, even if they couldn't conceptualize the Walkman or Invisalign, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you one more example. The biggest player in cloud computing isn't IBM, and it's not Microsoft. Why? Because they didn't get the idea first. Someone else got it first. And the people who got it first was Andy Jassy at Amazon. And he got it first because he saw something they were doing internally for their own computing power. And he realized, what if we could offer this by the minute or by the byte instead of having people have to create their own server farms? What if we rent this capacity? And of course, that's where the idea of cloud computing came from.
Mm-hmm.
He saw things through a different perspective. They developed something internally, and then he thought, wonder if there's a business here.
And that's exactly what happened with me as well with podcast production. I was like,
Yeah.
So
Right.
that's cool. All right.
Right.
Well, and then can you give us some views on when it comes to the notion of being an imperfectionist or embracing imperfectionism? Can you talk to us maybe a bit about the emotional hangups, or how do we make that journey? So it's like, oh yeah, now I'm just totally cool, making lots of mistakes and being totally imperfect. That could be quite a leap for some.
Yeah. So I think that the overarching mindset is imperfection or imperfectionism. And that really brings together all of the mindsets, too, we haven't talked about, or we talked about briefly, collective intelligence and show and tell, together with the ones that we have talked about. In the overarching idea is to go ahead and lean into risk. And I think this is the emotional thing that causes people either to freeze, I better wait till things are more stable, or to just like, jump, right? And you could look at Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and think, probably should have thought about that a little harder, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the way to get over the emotional either paralysis or impetuousness is to think about what things you can do. So curiosity, dragonfly perspective taking, or experimentation that you can do that are relatively quick, relatively low cost, and relatively low consequence when it goes wrong. So if you had those three things, I can get feedback quickly. It doesn't cost me too much to make this experiment. And the consequences of it going wrong are relatively modest. I can lean in and learn more about the game that's being played, see the structure, and again, we can't count on some historical structure, see the structure that's in the current game, and look at the behavior of the players that's in the current game. That gives me information and allows me to be more confident about my next step, even if what I did originally has some failures in it. I'll give you an example because it's always better to bring things to life, and it's another Amazon example. So Amazon is now a big player in what we call consumer financial services, right? They have something like a 24% share of all the transactions that occur online because people use Amazon Pay, even when they're not on the Amazon site. How did that happen? Well, did Amazon use its giant balance sheet to buy a huge bank or consumer finance company? Nope, they didn't. Well, why? So what they did instead is, starting around 2008, they made a couple of little investments in fintech companies. They hired a team from a failed fintech company. They tried to build their own version of what was then called Square, which is a little payment device, which is now called Cube. And they bought some IP. Almost all of those specific steps that I just described ended in failure, meaning they no longer exist today. But each of those things built their understanding, built their skill set because they brought in people, and built their capabilities ultimately to become a competitor. And that allowed them to climb kind of an invisible staircase to be competent enough to begin to do the things in consumer financial services that they're now known for, ultimately including an Amazon credit card and Amazon Pay. They did small, low consequence steps that, when apparently failed, actually helped build their capabilities and their confidence to become a real competitor in this space.
That's great. Well, Charles, I really geek out on all this stuff. I love problem solving and decision-making stuff. I think it's just massively leveraged, powerful skill that makes a world of difference in terms of, like, if there's a thing to learn or really invest in, it's probably this. And several organizations have said it's like the top skill for the decade or century that we're in. What I find interesting and intriguing is that sometimes in episodes where we've covered this. I've seen the data that my dear listeners aren't as jazzed about this as I am, or so it seems, in terms of, I thought this was one of like the most killer episodes ever. And then like the download and engagement numbers are like modest, like, oh yeah, it's all right. So I scratched my head a little bit, but my leading hypothesis is that people say, well, yeah, I know. I got tons of problems solved. I got lots of answers, and it doesn't seem to go anywhere when I share them with my collaborators and colleagues in the organization. So I'd love to hear, you got chapter 6, show and tell, storytelling to compel action. What are your pro tips for when we've got a great solution ready to pop into the world, make its debut? How do we get other people on board with that?
What a great segue and setup. Yeah. I mean, no matter how good a problem solver you are on your own, you won't make any change in the world. And I think it's almost an icon, right? The brilliant person laboring by themselves without recognition or understanding. And, I think that exists for a reason, which is the independence that allows some people to come up with brilliant ideas and solutions that are out of the norm doesn't necessarily make them compelling to others. And we love to go back to this very simple concept that you did as a kid, when probably in kindergarten or first grade, which is show and tell. And the way to bring people on board with your idea is to literally think about, how would I show and tell this? And sometimes smart people think, well, I'm going to give them the data. I'm going to give them a graph that tells them what the output is. What we've learned is, in a world where there's more and more data produced every day, in a world of polarization that we live in today, that people don't trust information the way they used to anymore. So to break through with your idea is actually much more difficult than it's ever been before. And the critical insight here is to speak to people's hearts, not just their minds. So when you construct your stories, think about what people's values are. And I'll give you an example here, which is, if you're in the Nature Conservancy, you want people to change their behavior about how they interact with the natural world. You could do that just by pointing out that we're destroying the world. The temperature's going up and species are dying. But people often don't pull their Subarus over to the side of the road and change their behavior unless you talk about something they really do care about, which is, for example, their kids. And even people who have very different political perspectives love their kids. And you can use something like that as a common ground to begin to build a story for change, which people will actually sign up for. And one of the reasons the Nature Conservancy has been quite a successful conservation organization is that it hasn't stinted when it comes to telling stories that speak not only to the facts, but also to the values that people care about.
And so that story can sound like, don't you want your children to be able to enjoy these beautiful spaces, or you want them to not live shorter lives because of pollution, like that sort of thing?
Better yet, a demonstration. Sure. I mean, what you just said makes sense, but what about a demonstration? So I'll give you a physical demonstration done by the Nature Conservancy. They were trying to convince wealthy donors that they should invest in building shellfish reefs in estuary areas, because estuaries are where fresh water comes out, but there's often pollution in that fresh water. And when it mixes with the salt water, this is where a lot of creatures grow up in estuaries. This is where we create some of the biggest environmental crises. If you put in oyster reefs, for example, or other shellfish reefs, those tiny creatures that are inside the shells actually are filter feeders, and they filter out a lot of the toxins and pollution that comes out of estuaries. What the Conservancy did in one famous presentation in Australia is they put 17 10-liter buckets at the back of the room, stacked in a beautiful pyramid. So everyone came into the room, and the first thing they noticed is these 17 beautiful green buckets stacked in a pyramid. Even before they said anything, they had the audience's attention, the philanthropist's attention. What's going on here? And they said, do you know that each oyster filters 170 liters of water a day and cleans that, as much as those 17 10-liter buckets holds each day? And by using that physical demonstration and tying it in, again, with values that people cared about, clean water for their kids, that demonstration opened up people's wallets in a way that a PowerPoint presentation never could.
And it's fun as I imagine the philanthropist, which I've done on a very tiny scale, is you get excited like, wait, one oyster and all that water?
Exactly.
Well, that sounds just like a killer return on investment. Where do I write the check?
Exactly. And so here's another example. Richard Feynman, he's speaking before the Space Shuttle Disaster Panel, and he thinks that the problem is with the O-rings because the launch was done at a low temperature. And he could have presented a table of data showing that O-rings fail at lower temperatures, which is true. What did he do? Had a glass of ice water on the desk in front of him and an O-ring in his pocket. He took out the O-ring, held it in the water with a little clamp that he purchased at the hardware store next door, and then he twisted the O-ring to show that it deformed and then cracked at that lower temperature, the temperature of ice water. Well, no one will ever forget his testimony. Even though he had a Nobel Prize and could have used all kinds of data, what he did was a short demonstration that grabbed people. And if you want your ideas, after you've done your clever problem solving, if you want your ideas to have currency, if you want your ideas to break through in a blizzard in the world that's a blizzard of ideas, think about how you would do show and tell.
I love it. Well, if you could just give us a few rapid fire bulleted examples. So we've got the ice water O-rings. We've got the big buckets of water. What are some other ways that we show stuff visually that's powerful?
There's some famous graphics in history that I always go back to. So that there's a famous nurse called Nightingale, Florence Nightingale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very few people realize that Nightingale was also one of the best statisticians of her day. And she drew this thing that's now sometimes called a rose crescent diagram to show the impact of basically the filthy conditions during the Crimean War of the middle 1800s. And she showed that way more soldiers were dying from the bacterial infection of their wounds or bad water that were actually dying from bullets. And she did that by showing this amazing graphic that's famous to this day that grabbed everybody's attention. She could have written a 150-page or 250-page finding, but that single graph convinced the British military that they needed to upgrade the public health facilities that were in the hospitals in Crimea, which eventually led, by the way, to a public health revolution back in the home country, Britain, because Queen Victoria paid attention to what was going on in Crimea. And we don't know this for sure, but apparently met Florence Nightingale. That's a person who figured out show and tell, and she changed the world. That's how we got public health. Not just a nurse, someone who changed everything.
Beautiful. Well, Charles, tell me anything else you really want to make sure to mention before we shift gears and hear about some of your favorite things?
Yeah, so I'll give you one more, which is I just think in the world we live in today, we talked about it very briefly at the beginning, but think about collective intelligence whenever you're trying to solve a problem and where you can outsource incredibly great ideas that will help you solve your problem. There's platforms like Kaggle, which allow you to bring in other people's ideas for a small amount of prize money, maybe an AI algorithm, maybe an AI swarm. The Nature Conservancy used that very effectively to create a program called Fish Face that allows computer recognition aboard boats to identify which fish are endangered species and should be put back in the water and which fish are okay to eat. They didn't have that capability internally at the Nature Conservancy, so they outsourced it for a $150,000 prize via Kaggle. That's just one of thousands of good ideas that come from bringing other people's expertise inside your organization, even when you're full of clever people. And so that would round out the 6 mindsets that I think will give people confidence that despite the pace of change and all the terrible things that are happening in the world, that we can step into that risk and confidently navigate our way.
Beautiful. Thank you. Now, could you share a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
Einstein's famous for saying if he had an hour to spend solving a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the nature of the problem and 5 minutes solving it. So he was a particularly clever guy. I think we can all agree. But there's so much benefit that comes from thinking through your problem from different perspectives before you run off and try your favorite technique. That's one of my favorite quotes.
All right. And a favorite study or experiment or piece of research?
Yeah, I think the research behind the book called The Selfish Gene, which was a book published by Richard Dawkins in the late 70s, is the most concise encapsulation of how evolution works, which is this powerful engine that's behind everything in the world today, including how humans compete with each other.
All right. And a favorite book?
I think my favorite book is probably E.O. Wilson's Biodiversity, which is sort of naturally flows from the Dawkins book. Biodiversity comes from the impact of how evolution works.
And a favorite tool, something you use to be awesome at your job.
I actually love old school woodworking tools. So my personal favorite tool would be a woodworking plane. I think it's amazing. They've been around for 3,000 years.
Mm-hmm. And a favorite habit, something you do that helps you be awesome at your job?
Climb the stairs.
All right. And is there a key nugget you share that really seems to connect and resonate with folks? They quote it back to you, they retweet it, they Kindle book highlight it?
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm hearing back now is around curiosity, which is people are thanking me for awakening them to their own curiosity and to the wellspring that comes from asking the question, why?
And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can find both the books I've published on LinkedIn, or you can find them on Amazon or any other great booksellers. We also have got a website, which is called theimperfectionists.org or bulletproofproblemsolving.com.
All righty. And do you have a final challenge or call to action for folks seeking to be awesome at their jobs?
Yeah, don't be afraid to lean into risk using relatively low cost, relatively reversible moves. You may make some mistakes, but you'll learn tons.
All right. Charles, thank you. This has been so fun. I wish you lots of fun problem solving and imperfection results. And thanks for taking the time.
It's been terrific. Thanks so much for having me, Pete.
I love so much what Charles has to say about using storytelling to connect to values and then to use visual aids. What I love about visual aids is it's so distinctive. It really stands out. It's so distinctive, you might be encountering some resistance right now. Like, that's really weird, Pete. Like, nobody ever really does that around here. And that's sort of exactly the whole reason why it's powerful. The use of large visual aids is rare. It's different. It stands out. It grabs attention, and it can powerfully resonate. Like, oh yeah, Pete was talking with the buckets. Right. That sticks. Great stuff from Charles. Again, the show notes, the transcript, the links to items we've referenced are found at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP900. Hope to catch you next time. And peace.
Thanks for listening. To get the most out of the show, we recommend 2 key things. First, check out the extra resources at awesomeatyourjob.com. You can find this episode's transcript and links, as well as the perfect episode for your situation. You can search the full-text transcripts of hundreds of episodes or explore episodes tagged by topic and competency covered. Second, subscribe to the podcast and get future episodes automatically. You can subscribe by telling Siri and several other smartphones and speakers, subscribe to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, or by tapping subscribe in your podcast player of choice. If you'd like some extra help figuring out podcasts and how subscriptions work, visit awesomeatyourjob.com/subscribe for guidance. Hope to catch you on the next episode of How to Be Awesome at Your Job.